sleep in my own bed. It's close enough. This is great. I don't always like flying to Denmark or whatever. I'm glad to be right here with you guys and talking about what we can do as people who live in this part of the country, and what can we do for the prosperity of our generation and generations to come. And what I'm talking about today is I'm giving kind of the big picture overview of everything, not super technical detail, but a big picture overview. And so what I want to do is talk about some things that maybe some of you know about, maybe you don't, but that might help you to maybe convey these ideas more effectively, or to understand or appreciate the system that we have, or, well, I should say are supposed to have, so that we can communicate it better and win more converts to our cause. So I'm going to do this in two stages. The first stage is I'm going to describe to you the actual workings of a market economy and show you what it accomplishes, because it accomplishes things that frankly are miraculous, but we've grown so accustomed to them we don't even notice them anymore. We just assume this is just the way the world works, and we don't appreciate things. We become ungrateful for things. So I want us to have gratitude. I think ingratitude is one of the greatest sins in the world, so I want us to be grateful for what we've got. But then secondly, life is not all about order and efficiency. And it's not even indeed all about material things. But I do want to point out that one of the great, most common criticisms one will hear of a market economy is that it leaves the poor in the dust. Right? The rich do very well, they have their yachts, and they walk around with their sacks of money with dollar signs on them. But the poor person is just left to fend for himself, and isn't this terrible? So I want to spend some time talking about that issue too. Showing that, in fact, there is no system that leads to a better outcome for everybody. All right, so let's start. First thing is, if you talk to somebody who is, let's say, if you were talking to a 19th century Marxist, he would say that one of the problems, just one of the problems with a market economy, is that he would say there is an anarchy of production, because there's no central planner barking out orders through a bullhorn at everybody. It's everybody on his own deciding, I'm going to start this business and I'm going to produce this type of widget, and you're going to produce that type of widget with your business, and you're going to hire this many people and locate your plant here or there. And a lot of us are going to produce the same good. Or a lot of us will produce goods that seem more or less interchangeable. You produce Coke, I produce Pepsi. And so the Marxist view would be that this is unnecessary duplication, this is chaotic, there's no order to it. And it would be far better to substitute for this disorder the order that comes from a guy barking out commands through a bullhorn, through a central planner. Now, superficially, that seems correct. It does seem that, wouldn't it be better if somebody just drew up a blueprint and then gave orders to people? All right, I've figured it out. We need 7 people to produce grain and 8 people to grow flowers or whatever, and then just assign people tasks. Wouldn't that be better if we had the capacity of one planner's mind, and he could conceive of everything and then impose it on society? That would be much better. Now, the reason that's been given that why that can't work is that, well, there's no incentive for people to work because everybody gets the same pay, and so why would you bother working? That's an issue. But the central issue is actually something different. This was an issue that was touched upon in 1920 by Ludwig von Mises in an essay called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. This is an essay that if we really did live in a free society, all school children would read. As it turns out, none of them have ever heard of it. But it was in this essay that Mises showed why this can't possibly work. And what he showed is this. He said, what we have in a market economy is the ability to calculate profit and loss. Because a businessman can say, let's see, here were my inputs. I had 1 ton of bricks, 1 ton of lumber, and 1 ton of steel. And then I produced these consumer goods, and I earned this much in revenue. Now let me compare my revenues with how much I spent on the steel and the lumber, etc., and see how I'm doing. Am I doing well or am I doing badly? Let me just do the arithmetic here and see how I'm doing. And then I will adjust my production decisions in the future. Maybe I need more of something else, less of another thing. Maybe I should locate my physical plant 2 miles down the road where the property values are less, but my transportation costs will be more. You can figure all this out because you have numbers to attach to these things. You can figure out, should I be located here or there? Should I use this production process that uses mostly rubber? Should I use this production process that uses mostly lumber? Well, if you didn't have any numbers, any dollar amounts to attach to those inputs, how would you evaluate whether, if they were both equally productive, should you use the lumber or the rubber? You'd have no way of knowing. But in a market economy, we have prices for all these inputs. These prices tell us things. They help us to calculate what would be the best way for me to produce widgets given these prices. If this particular input is very expensive, I'll try to find a way to produce widgets using another input. And the reason this particular input is expensive is because a lot of other production processes need this input and they are bidding for it. So it's through these various bids and the settling of prices that we ensure in a market economy that we produce the most highly valued things with the lowest valued inputs we can, so that we conserve and are good stewards of the limited resources we possess. It is the price system, freely arrived at, not with any dictator, nobody with a bullhorn, just the natural process of buying and selling gives rise to these prices, which allows entrepreneurs to calculate how they're doing. Are they producing profits or losses? And if they're making losses, can they figure out where are the losses coming from in my business? If I'm a baker, are the losses coming in my pastries or are they coming in my bread? And then they adjust their production processes accordingly. And this is how order comes about, because we can calculate profit and loss. Now, Mises said, suppose you had a socialist economy, however. In a socialist economy, there is no private ownership of the lumber, of the steel, of the assembly line equipment, of the factories, of all this stuff. This is all owned by the Central Planning Committee. And because it's all owned by one thing, there's no buying and selling. Nobody buys and sells. Like I wouldn't sell myself this tie. Like it would be nonsensical. It would be pointless. It would be a child's game because I own it already. Well, if the government owns all the inputs of production, they're not going to buy it. There's no buying and selling of it. And if there's no buying and selling, there are no prices. So therefore, the Central Planning Committee must make decisions for millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people completely in the dark. They have no way of knowing which production process is the most efficient because they have no way of comparing lumber and rubber. Well, I mean, they're incommensurable. There's no third unit you can compare them with. So they have no way of knowing what to do, what to produce, where to produce it, how much to produce, using what process, using what inputs. They are completely in the dark. And the result is ludicrously and destructively uneconomic decision-making. In fact, the socialists basically had to cheat. What the commies basically did was they just looked on the world market and they looked at what were the capitalist countries paying for steel, and then they would sort of arbitrarily slap that onto their own steel prices because they had to have some way of figuring out relative scarcities and which is the best process to use. So they wouldn't dare actually have a whole world operating like this. I mean, there was an old joke about from the commies that they would in fact let one market society survive so they would know what to charge for everything. So you see, they recognize there's a problem here. You can't figure out what to do without this feedback mechanism in the form of prices. And so what you're going to have is complete chaos. You're going to have tractors, but you're not going to have anything to power them with. You're going to have a whole bunch of one thing and none of the complementary good that's necessary because you don't have this decentralized price mechanism that occurs spontaneously on the market. So the central planner produces chaos, and the market with no overall central plan produces order. It's contrary to what you would be led to expect. It seems counterintuitive, which is why so many people reflexively even today feel like, well, maybe if we had a central plan, it might, it didn't work in these other countries, but it does seem like it should work better. But it doesn't, it can't. And finally on this point, even when we look at the smallest, most modest little product, there are actually miracles contained in it. Now, some of you are familiar, I would assume, with an essay written many years ago called I, Pencil. And it's an essay written by a guy named Leonard Read, and he's writing it from the first-person point of view of a pencil. So it's like the pencil is writing the essay. And the pencil is telling you, basically, I am like the most interesting thing in the world. And you think, this is one uppity pencil, right? But he goes on to say that, look, he says, think about all that was necessary to make me possible. I'm a modest little pencil. But he says, first of all, what's the pencil made out of primarily? Wood. But the pencil is trying to convey to you is that nobody in this room knows how to make a pencil. Nobody in the world knows how to make a pencil. Now you think now the pencil is being way too ambitious with that claim. But because you think to yourself, well, my friend Fred works at a pencil factory. I'm sure he could make a pencil. But think about it. The whole process of making a pencil, no one could possibly know. Pencil's made out of wood. How are you going to get that wood? You've got to chop down a tree. If you're going to chop down a tree, you need an axe or a saw, which means you're going to need steel, which means you're going to need to get iron ore. You're going to need to know all about that. You need to know about mining. And then not only that, but you also need the rubber for the eraser, which is a whole other production process. You need trucks to transport the wood and the rubber. The trucks require gasoline. They need rubber for the tires and all these other things. There's the graphite, which comes from South America. And then there's a little metal thing at the top. I mean, there's all this stuff. Then there's paint. That has a million production processes associated with that. And when you consider it all, there is no one brain that could have the technical knowledge to pull off the production of a pencil. So you would think, if you just heard somebody described all those steps, and believe me, I haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg with the pencil production. Somebody described that to you, you would think there's no way we could make such a miracle item. Right? This would just have to come from, Martians would have to bring this thing to us. There's no way we could do this. And especially if we did do it, though, then darn it, for all your free market propaganda, we would need a pencil commissar in charge, directing the production around the world, making sure that everything's produced in the right quantities at the right time, with no surpluses or shortages, just enough to produce pencils. Surely we would need that. And yet, look around you, right? There are more pencils than you know what to do with. Like you see a pencil on the street, you throw it in the garbage, like it doesn't even mean anything to you. You don't stand there and say, oh, miracle of creation, I can't believe. But when you think about it, it really is something else. That this happens, and it happens all the time, and nobody even notices it. That's why economics is interesting. Because a lot of people think economics is boring. It's a lot of facts and figures. Well, that's if you have a bad professor. But honest to goodness, the fact that something like that can occur, and economics shows you how it can occur. How is that possible? That all these people's plans come together in just the right way to make this little product. If that interests you, then economics should interest you. All right, so that's why we should, first of all, be proud to support what we support, because the system that we support produces this sort of miraculous outcome. But then there's the other side of things that I want to look at, and that is the prosperity angle. Okay, maybe it produces pencils really well, but maybe we're all poor. Like maybe a pencil is like all we have. Like we have to also look at what are the outcomes in terms of prosperity, income, poverty, wealth. And here, I think the market also succeeds dramatically. Here we have prosperity for all. And I'm going to show you how that happens in a minute, but first I want to persuade you that indeed it has happened. When we look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and these sorts of indexes are produced annually by various organizations, and they look at different countries in the world, and they evaluate them according to how free they are economically. And what do you know? The freest economies also tend to be the wealthiest. But and by free, I just mean there are no constraints, or not no, but there are fewer constraints on the ability of human beings to make purchases, make sales, and open businesses and things like that. But what's interesting is when you look at the poor in those countries, the poor also enjoy the greatest material wealth and the fewest deprivations in the economies that are the freest. Well, that's a pretty big piece of empirical evidence for our side. But we also have the 20th century and indeed the 19th century as well to count for us. So I have noted a number of times that when you look at the statistics regarding absolute poverty, which is a measure economists use for people who are living just in grinding, unspeakable poverty. In the year 1820, that was about 80% of the world lived like that. By 1950, it was down to 50%. By the early 90s, it was in about 33%. And then by the early 2000s, it was down to just under 20%. Now, that's quite something. In fact, there has been more progress against poverty around the world in the past 50 years than there had been in the previous 500. In the years from the early 80s to the early 2000s, we had, for the first time in any 20-year period in history, both the percentage and the absolute number of impoverished people fall. I mean, when you look at one of my favorite old shows is The Honeymooners. Now, Ralph Cramden was a cheapskate. I'll grant you that. But the point is, it was conceivable that at that time you could have no refrigerator, no telephone, no radio, and no TV. That was considered at least possible. They weren't considered complete oddballs and outcasts from society. Now, everybody has these things, and they still feel like, I haven't been given enough stuff. I need more. Somebody give me some more stuff. Again, there is not the pause to recognize we should be thankful for this, that the worst kind of poverty, like the kind that Americans couldn't even begin to conceive of, has more or less been indeed eliminated. Then around the world, you look at the poorest countries. From the 60s to today, their caloric intake has increased by 1/3. Their life expectancy, as compared to the richer countries, has gone up from 60% of that life expectancy to 80% of that life expectancy, and so on. We've seen in late 19th century England, the difference between the rich and the poor in terms of life expectancy was 17 years. Today it's 2 years. It used to be, between the rich and the poor, there was a difference of 5 inches in height. Now it's less than 1 inch. In the United States throughout the 20th century, the real incomes of people in the bottom quintile, that is, the people in the lowest 20% income distribution, have seen their real incomes increase by 1,900%. Well, that's not a record to be ashamed of, or to run away from, or to be embarrassed by. Now, my remarks would not be complete if I did not say something about money. We're talking about sound money at this event, in part. When we talk about sound money, we're talking about money that governments can't manipulate. And man, they try. With whatever you give them, they'll try. But with gold or silver or one of these precious metals, the problem is they can't make photocopies of it. They can't print up a whole lot of it. And that's why they hate it, because it constrains their ability to spend, and it constrains their ability to siphon off resources from the rest of us. Because think if you were a counterfeiter, and you just printed up money that looked like real US dollars, and you started spending it, you would be just taking stuff from everybody else without contributing anything. The normal way you get money is you contribute something, you get paid for contributing it, and then you go out and buy something. So you gave society something, then you take something. But if you're a counterfeiter, all you do is produce the money out of nothing. You didn't get that money because you provided a service to society or produced some goods. You just created the money out of nothing. Then when you go to spend that, you're just grabbing. So when you earn money honestly, you earned it because you gave and then you grab. But the counterfeiter just grabs. And that's what governments want to do when they create money out of thin air. They create paper money. That's a way that they can spend without having to produce anything and without having to tax us noticeably, thinking that we'll be too thick to realize what's happening. And unfortunately, they've been right a lot of the time. People haven't realized what's been happening. But this, make no mistake, this is the reason that fashionable opinion is appalled at the idea that you might have a gold standard or some kind of precious metal backing for the currency. It is not because this is bad for the economy or all the phony baloney excuses they give. It's because this means less power for the government and less power for its favored constituencies. That is the reason. There is no other reason. That is why they are opposed to it. And that is why Mises said that sound money belongs up there on the list of guarantees of liberty, up there with written constitutions and bills of rights. So what has the record of sound money actually been? Well, it turns out that actually it's been pretty darn good. That in England, when England was on the gold standard into the 19th century, England had basically the greatest period of economic progress in the history of the world. Now, we're told that sound money would cause a depression and Well, who are you going to believe? These whining complainers who just want to grab more of your dough, or your own eyes? Because England survived quite well with sound money. The United States had, again, some of the greatest economic progress in the history of the world during the period of the classical gold standard. So if you're looking at in through the 1820s, down through the Civil War, and then from the 1870s up through the eve of World War I, absolutely astonishing economic growth and progress, increase in incomes dramatic for all classes, wage rates, real wage rates rising, like everything you could ask for, prices falling. Today, the the geniuses tell us that if prices fall, this is terrible and it leads to a depression. Prices fell all through the 19th century, and it just made Americans richer because they could get more stuff with their dough. Yeah, I'm going to take a few minutes digression to point out, by the way, how it is that we got to the point where if you lived in, let's say, 1800, you'd be much poorer than you are now. And it is worth pausing to note how that happened, because we're told that you need inflation of the money supply, or otherwise there's going to be a depression. And yet, we saw this huge increase in standard of living without inflation. So apparently inflation is not a necessary ingredient. So then what is the ingredient? And basically, here's the quick answer. If you think back to, let's say, the year 1720, and you look at the way people are living, they're living hand to mouth, basically. One bad harvest, and they could be on the verge of starvation. This is not an enviable position to be in. They don't have modern dentistry. Also, I mean, like, this would be horrifying in some ways. So how did we get from there to here? And the answer is it because the government developed welfare programs, or the government created a lot of money out of thin air and could buy us a lot of things with it? The answer basically is this. I give this thought experiment. I say, let's suppose we have our economy today, 2013, and suppose when all of us are sleeping, some Martians come and they take all our factories and they take all our production and assembly line equipment and all our communications technology and all our transportation technology. And all we're left with is riding on horseback, and they're going to be sports about it. They're going to let us use the telegraph. And that's what we've got. Now, suppose in that primitive economy you went back to your job, if your job still existed. If you were making plasma TVs, you're unemployed now. There's no way to make plasma TVs with just horseback and a telegraph and your bare hands. So that's not going to happen. But suppose you still had your job and you said, well, time to go to my 9-to-5 job, 40 hours a week. 40 hours a week with no machinery to help you, you would produce like a pittance of what you used to produce. Society wouldn't be able to survive. There wouldn't be enough goods to keep people alive. You would have to work 80 hours a week or 100 hours a week just barely to get by. Now, that would not be because the wicked capitalists are forcing these long hours on you. It would be because the economy is so primitive that unless you work a backbreaking schedule, not enough stuff will be produced to keep the population alive. That's the reason. But yet when you go back and look at your textbook, or you remember what your 7th grade teacher told you, the implication was the reason people were poor in 1720 or 1820 was that the rich people had all the stuff and they were selfishly refusing to distribute it to everybody. The problem with that is, if 1 out of every 1,000 people is a rich capitalist, it doesn't matter if, okay, so that person probably eats twice the food, fancier food, has 10 times as much furniture as the average person. Okay, so you divide his 10 times as much furniture by 1,000, and you start distributing a portion of it to everybody. Like, okay, you get 1 table leg now that we took from the rich guy, and you get 1 mouthful of his rice or whatever. This would have 0 impact on anybody except the rich guy, who would probably move away after you did that. So the idea that, well, that was what was standing in the way. We didn't have enough government to redistribute things. No, to the contrary, it had nothing whatsoever to do with government. It had to do with the fact that business firms take their profits and they buy machines with it, so that with your bare hands you can produce a whole lot more. My father was a forklift operator. If he didn't have a forklift, how much could he possibly aspire to get paid to stack pallets when he can't even reach some of these? Forget about the weight. He can't even reach some of these heights. So they buy forklifts to make him more productive. And this allows more goods to be produced. More goods are produced with about the same amount of money in the economy. Each unit of money becomes more valuable and can fetch more goods. And that's how our standard of living increased. It has nothing whatsoever to do with government or inflating the money supply or anything like that. We see laptops always seem to go down in price. Well, imagine an economy where that was true of everything. And that was what you had under a sound money, free market economy. The Federal Reserve System, was created 100 years ago this year. It was the Federal Reserve Act was passed in December. If I get a boo. It was passed in December of 1913. It opened its doors early the following year. And the Federal Reserve System was an inflationary system. Initially, there was a gold aspect to it, but it did encourage creating more money than there was gold backing it up. And then by 1933, there wasn't any more gold backing it up except for international transactions. And then in 1971, that was taken away. And now the government can with the Fed's help, get itself out of fiscal jams in various ways. But we're told that, well, the Fed, though, has given us more stability. Now, they say this after the biggest financial bubble in the history of the world just burst, but they call this stability in this Orwellian world. But it turns out, I've actually done work on this, it turns out that to the contrary, the Fed, contrary to what we think, has not given us fewer or shallower recessions than we used to have. And if you're interested in this subject, because you will have people saying to you, before we had the Fed, we had ups and downs, how can you blame that on the Fed? Ho, 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 they'll say to you. I have a page on my website dedicated to this, tomwoods.com/panics. tomwoods.com/panics has a talk by me on this subject specifically and some links if you want more on that. And I'll note also, by the way, a lot of people follow my videos and stuff and follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and I appreciate that. And none of them know that I blog every day. I blog like 3 to 7 times every weekday. So visit me at tomwoods.com for that, please. Okay, so we don't need to go into that. I'll just say I've got the data there if you want to examine it. So the Fed's record is not so good. And also, of course, what has it done to the dollar? The dollar is now worth about 4 cents as compared to what it was when the Fed got started. So 96% of its value has been drained from it. And as I said this earlier this week, what the Fed supporters will say is, well, that's okay because the dollar lost its value very slowly under the Fed. So you really shouldn't, I'm not making that up, you shouldn't really hold that against them. This happened very gradually. Now, could you imagine if it were the other way around, that under a gold standard, the dollar lost its value gradually? Do you think they'd let us get away with, oh, well, look, that happened only gradually? No, they'd be pounding this over our heads, right? So they can't lose no matter what happens. They've stacked the deck. So what that means, that our dollar has lost value, is this, that before you had the current system, when you had gold coins or silver coins circulating as money, not the role they have now where they're kind of like an inflation hedge and people often don't use them in monetary transactions. But back when that was what you used, you could save for your old age by accumulating these coins because they held their value. You can look at the statistics. If you bought a men's suit in 1800, it would be about the same price in 1900. In fact, it would be a little cheaper in 1900. So it would hold its value. Today, only a lunatic would say, well, I've got to save for my old age, so I'm going to stack up these green pieces of paper printed by the Federal Reserve, and by the time I retire, these are going to be worth a pretty penny. Well, they'll be worth closer to a penny than you realize. So no one would do that, because they're going to lose at least a third of their value, if not more. So what does that mean the average person is now forced to do? The average person, just to break even, now feels like, I got to go into the stock market, I got to buy stocks. I got to buy bonds. I got to speculate. Most of us don't belong in the stock market doing that. But people are doing this just to break even because this system, which is supposed to be the system of the people, we can't crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. No, let's crucify them on a papier-mâché cross? Like, how is that better? And in fact, now, what are they going to do for their old age? Now they're going to become speculative, and if you were in the S&P 500, that still hasn't gained back where it was in 2000. That's the system that's supposed to be for the common man. If you really shouldn't believe that, I'll just say that. This system does benefit somebody, but it obviously is not the average person who has to scramble to figure out ways to provide for old age. Okay, and then my last point about money would be order. How does a free market in money provide order? The same way that the market in general provides order, by regulating production by profit and making sure that we get things produced in the way that is least costly in terms of foregone opportunities. How about money? Well, exactly how a completely free market in money would work is beyond my scope today, but I have a page for that, tomwoods.com/money, if you want to learn about that. I make these pages so that I can not seem like I'm copping out. Like I say, look, I really have talked about this, and now you can go look at it. But here's the basic gist of how it works. If you have a free market, if you treat banking like it were any other business, no special privileges, no bailouts, just a regular business like any other business, the way it works basically is like this. The bank stores your money for safekeeping. The bank can be used as an institution that you write checks with, so it sounds kind of like a bank today. But the interest rates that you would see would be meaningful. That is to say, what what money and interest rates help to do is to coordinate production over time. And what I mean by that is the price system helps us to figure out what goods we should produce. Because you can figure out, well, I'd make more profit if I produced widgets as opposed to popsicles or something. You figure that out by thinking in terms of the price system. But it's not just what product should I produce, it's how long-term of a project should I take on? Should I invest in a project that's going to take 3 years before it'll turn a profit? Or 4 years before it's completed or whatever? These things also have to be decided. Because if I'm going to work on a really long-term project, I need to borrow resources to sustain myself during that project. And if people in society aren't ready to lend me those resources, then I can't sustain my project and I shouldn't begin it. And interest rates basically regulate this. When interest rates are low, entrepreneurs will say, okay, now's the time for us to invest in our long-term project because we can get cheap financing. Why do they get cheap financing? Because there are a lot of funds available that people have saved. And those resources allow the completion of these long-term projects. But when you get a Federal Reserve involved that has a monopoly on the money supply and has government privileges, it lowers interest rates artificially, which misleads entrepreneurs into thinking, now's the time to invest in my long-term project. All these resources are available. But they're really not. This is a false signal. This is white noise that's interfering with their ability to make sound, orderly economic decisions, and this is where you get the boom and bust. When you have a free market in money and a free market with interest rates, you get economic progress. When you have the system we have now, you have some progress mixed in with a fake boom, and then this leads to a crash, and then some progress, and then a crash. And you get this cyclical pattern. Karl Marx said the cyclical pattern is because capitalism is stupid, and it's got contradictions built into it. And there are people, even free marketers, who believe, well, you've got to take the good with the bad with the free market. That's not true. And in fact, that's what the Austrian free market economists have shown, is that this part of the economy that it goes up and down, that is not a natural feature of a market economy. There's no reason that that should happen. It is caused by this systemic intervention into the most important market of all, the money market. Money is half of every transaction. If you are meddling with that, interfering with that, that's a system-wide interference. You're going to have a system-wide consequence. So here's the choice that faces you here as Missouri moves forward. I mean, there are models in the world that you can look to. You could look to France. You could be like France, where they say, you know, we'll just impose a 35-hour week on everybody, and that'll spread around more work. And yet the story of France for the past 40 years has been unemployment. The story of Europe, with a few exceptions, has been, for the past 40 years, unemployment. Even though they have had everything that the interventionists into the economy could have asked for. They've had the deficits, they've had the spending, they've done it all. All these things that are supposed to cure unemployment haven't done it. For 4 years or more, we've had unbelievable deficits. These are supposed to cure unemployment. And we see stagnation, and we may be getting worse again. They don't know what they're doing. You could follow those people, and you would be treated, welcomed, feted with open arms by the New York Times and all fashionable opinion. However, if you don't hate mankind, you might follow a different model, which is the one I'm describing to you now, which is the crazy idea that human beings are not owned by other people, that ought to be able to be free to enter into their own transactions with one another and enjoy the fruits or suffer the consequences of those decisions, and live in a society where people have enough civic virtue that they have the good and spontaneous sense to help one another.
I found my job description in our Bill of Rights as a state representative and a state senator. Article 1, Section 2 of our Missouri Constitution, that all government, all constitutional government, is intended to promote the general welfare of the people. That all persons have a natural right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the enjoyment of the gains of their own industry. That to give security to these things is the principal office of government. And then when government does not confer this security, it fails in its chief design. That was my job description as your state senator, as your state representative. It is the job description for every representative and senator that took that oath to this Constitution. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the enjoyment of the gains of your own industry. Now, I don't know if that is unique to the Missouri Constitution, but I love that line. I love it. What's my responsibility? To protect what is yours. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to the government. It's yours. And really, that's what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about sound policies, good government. How can we, as your public servants, ensure that we're protecting yours with the power that you have delegated to us? Missouri needs policies that shout out economic freedom. Over the past 30 years, Missouri has constructed a tax policy that has led to economic slavery, not economic freedom. We have put in place 61 different targeted tax credit programs that have given government the ability to pick winners and losers. To say to this industry, you're a winner in Missouri, and to say to this one, you're a loser. That's not government's job. That doesn't work, folks. It's never worked. I believe that fixing this unjust and broken tax policy is part of a broader discussion, and that's what we're here to talk about today. I mean, having a sound monetary policy in the state is crucial. Having tax reform is crucial. Regulatory reform and tort reform are all a package that will make Missouri more friendly to job creation, putting our people to work, and solving a lot of our economic problems. It will lead Missouri to economic freedom.
And probably most important, I brought a copy with me today, a book called The Law by Frederic Bastiat, a French guy for French people who didn't read it. This, folks, here has still been the core foundation that has motivated me more than anything else in the whole realm of economics. I know many of you read this, but I just want to read the very, very last paragraph of a very, very short book. And it says, "And now that the legislators and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they finally end where they should have begun. May they reject all systems and try liberty. For liberty is acknowledgement of faith in God and His works." You know, it's amazing. When you begin to know the truth and you begin to get involved and know these things, it creates a burden. It creates a passion, desire. As mentioned earlier, why you all are here instead of doing what most people are doing and going out and doing normal things. Because you care. You have a passion to carry this thing forward. Well, I joined the Marine Corps here after college here and continued my interest in economics. And we were in the Mediterranean, and you know, after 4 or 5 months of steaming around in circles and cleaning rifles and all this other kind of stuff you're doing, I decided to hold an economic class. And I brought out, and I just at the spur of the moment happened to think about it, and maybe I was inspired because I looked at my pocket and I had found a pre-1964 quarter. So I had the Marines on the side of the flight deck, and I said, "Okay, guys, how much is a gallon of gas?" And at that time, they said 80 cents. And I said, "No, a gallon of gas is only a quarter." I said, "You could take this to any coin shop, 1963 here on the coin. They'll give you $1. You buy gas and have some change back." And that was kind of an eye-opener. And then I thought about my first economic class I ever gave and rolled it forward to today. How much is a gallon of gas? Well, $3, a little more than $3. I said, no, it's still a little less than a quarter. Because you can take this coin to any coin dealer, get $5, buy yourself a gallon of gas, and have $2 left over. What a deal. What's happened in that period of time? how does it affect the small business and as entrepreneurs? And especially in today's environment, with, as you talked about, the regulation, the litigation issues, the tax issues that the speaker's been talking about. All of these things are coming at you, and more than ever before. I remember thinking, gosh, my grandfather sure had it easy back in those days. And then my dad had it easier. And I'm not active as much in the business anymore. I'm thinking the new generation. But a young man wants to be an entrepreneur when he graduates from college. What are the challenges that are having there? And you have all of these things coming at you from all directions. Complete chaos is in the marketplace. You know, with the aspect of free credit, and almost in a sense, the whole monetary system falling apart. Everything, we all know the issues and the problems here, and that's why we're here. But, you know, if we had sound money, if we had something stable, if we had honest money, at least that's one element, one platform. So when you're doing these long-term investments and you're trying to understand how to evaluate these issues, when I was a little boy and went to the grocery store, I saw this scale when you used to actually weigh your produce there and put it in your cart and everything else, and it said honest weight. Honest weight? Why do they have to say honest weight? Well, we talk about honest money. And it makes my heart sick when I see some of these older people who have to go back and get in the workplace, work at McDonald's, work at Walmart, because what they were saving and what they thought they had, you know, they don't have, you know, at one time when they were saving the silver quarters pre-64, you know, we know from my example, if they had that kind of solid money, when they retire, they wouldn't have to do that. But they got this junk to deal with. These are some of the opportunities here in Missouri that if I would say there's nothing more American than freedom of choice. We're not talking about replacing anything or getting rid of anything. We're just talking about having another alternative, another opportunity in terms of some sound money. Give Americans freedom of choice. Give Missourians a freedom of choice. What a great opportunity that is. And it'll be one solid foundation, one more element, as the talks, as Jim's talked about, bringing Missouri back, you know, as that light in a dark place to say, you know, we're doing some things here. And we're doing some things here to attract business, long-term thinking, solid money, solid economy, and I'm absolutely convinced that the battles are right here in the state.
Economic freedom and prosperity and liberty, doesn't have to be a partisan issue. You know, it's a Missouri issue. It's an American issue, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. What Tom was talking about, you never talk about the facts that Tom was talking about. You know, us versus us 100 years ago, or society versus society 100 years ago, the advancements. And yes, we still have poor people, and we still need a social safety net and all that, but look at how much better people are off, and look how much more we can do with freedom and opportunity. And so that's the right message and messenger I think we were missing.
I'm going to talk today from the standpoint of my greatest role, as Speaker Jones said. I'm a father. I'm a father. And I'm concerned about what's going on in this country, as many of you are, and the foundation and the reasons that we're running into the problems that we're seeing here. I mean, every one of us in the last several years has got something on our brain, and it has to do with economics, whether we're still doing well or whether we're struggling, which many of us are. There are reasons for that, and we're concerned because guess what? It doesn't seem like the situation's getting a whole lot better, does it? Not a lot. In fact, as we look at history, we can say a lot of times throughout history when governments and central banks have kind of gone down the path that they're going down now, hasn't ended well. When you give monopoly control of creating money and managing, quote unquote, managing the economy to either a government or a central bank, it doesn't end well. And that's the track we're on right now. So we have a right to be concerned. God's given me the great privilege over the last couple of years of traveling this country on behalf of the 10th Amendment Center and talking about this very subject. And I want to tell you something that I'm blown away by. This is my home state. You know, this is where my passion lies in helping us improve our situation. When I'm out talking to people, or I should say talking, afterward, you know, people generally come up to me and say, Doug, what can we do? What can we do? What are the things that we can do in light of this environment that we see that's going on out there? And one of the things that we also do is we say, guess what? We want to encourage our legislators to do some very simple things, okay? Very simple, common sense things. And they've been spoken about by all the speakers today. Every one of them have. I've heard choice. Choice is one of them. Guess what? Let's take that monopoly control away from the folks who are now in charge of managing our monetary system, and let's give them a little competition, a little free market competition, right? Well, guess what? We have the opportunity to do that at the state level. We do. And it's not that difficult. It's a common sense thing that is again, this is a nice thing about following all these great speakers, is they've said it all before. I just have to point at them and say, listen to them. They're smart guys. They're smart guys. So we can come in behind and just do some very common sense things in terms of encouraging our legislators to take this step. It's not a major thing. Economics, as Dr. Woods said, is one of those things that it crosses all demographics. It crosses all socio-economical, whatever status you're in there. It affects every one of us. So it can be and should be a very nonpartisan issue. What's the downside of saying, okay, if we have the opportunity and ability to establish a foundation to grow an economy on, and at the same time give our people choice, there's that word again, insurance to protect them maybe against some things in case, this system that's out there that's very unstable does go off track. There are a lot of people who think they can hold on to it. They may or may not be right. But guess what? As legislators in Missouri, don't we have a moral responsibility? Don't you have a moral responsibility to say, if I can offer a level of choice and protection to my constituents, isn't that something that I'm morally obligated to do? I think so, and I think that's one of the ways that we can approach this. It's not that difficult. We're not changing the world. We're not ending the Fed. We're not going down that path. We're just saying, listen, there are some common sense things that we can do to implement in our state to take advantage of the environment, the economic stability that can be generated by putting in place the foundation of a sound monetary system. Now, I'd like to give you an example of the reality of how that happens. I mean, it's real. It's practical. This can be done and is being done. In 2011, the state of Utah passed a Sound Money Act. I don't know if many of you know that, but they did. The first state in 80, 100 years to do such a dastardly thing, is to say, wait a minute, there's this thing called Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution that says no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin to tender payment debts. Hey, let's do that. Okay? Let's do that. And the economic impact that has been had in that state because of this simple bill is significant. Now, Mr. Craig Franco was due to speak here. He couldn't make it because he had a business issue come up that required his attention related to this issue. He's a very, very, very busy man right now because he's directly involved in implementing and laying a foundation to implement sound money in the state of Utah. I met him at the ceremonial bill signing in 2011 when Governor Herbert out there actually signed this bill into law. We've become friends. So I know what he's involved in pretty well. And so he just kind of basically passed the mantle to me to say, here, Doug, here's what's going on in Utah. Share this with your people and let them know that you can be a part of this too. We, as Missourians, can be a part of this too. Here's some of the things that he's seeing in the state of Utah. They've been able to develop global partnerships in Europe and Asia within the precious metals trade because of their relationships in precious metals. There's a lot of activity that goes on in these markets that people they don't realize, especially when you're talking about in the areas of Africa and Asia. Guess what? Those guys get it. You know what? They understand. China legalized the holding and purchase and private ownership of gold and silver in 2004 for the first time in I don't know how long. Long time. They get it. They understand the need for these things. So as we partner with them, as Utah Gold and Silver Depository, that's Craig's company, has partnered with these guys, it's brought economic opportunities into the state of Utah. And I'll give you a little example here. It says an increase in economic development opportunities between Utah, Europe, and Asia. For example, United States Gold and Silver Depository, through partnership agreements with 2 villages in Ghana, Africa, has put mining equipment, water treatment equipment, medical goods and services, and educational supplies on the ground in these villages. So there's a humanitarian aspect to this as well. The poverty that's generated by the failure of these systems is now being kind of taken care of as we have a state that's stepped up and is now moving in the direction of re-implementing it. I think that's kind of a neat thing. All the aforementioned were developed by local Utah companies. Okay? So there's job creation that's coming out of that. One village alone, their direct impact will be an infusion of $60 million over the next 12 months. That's into Africa. Companies' sales generated in the state of Utah to do all these things, okay? They're making a difference in the lives of these people, and they are also helping local business. The numbers get to be rather outstanding as well. Development of global strategic financial partnerships. Currently, UGSD holds 5 supply contracts with 2 global central banks, 2 global banks, 3 central banks. And for delivery of precious metals, over the next 3 years, their contracts are for $100 billion. Okay? That's real money flowing into the state of Utah. What's that going to do for economic development? Okay? What's that going to do? And the numbers, I mean, they just go on and on. These guys get it. They get it. These other nations understand. And so as we're developing, as you're able to develop and extend a hand of partnership with these nations, it isn't just the transaction of gold and silver that happens. There are real jobs that get created. Real people benefit from it. Not just from the reestablishment of sound money, but from these countries that have that as its root, a part of who they are and who mine it and develop it. I think it's a wonderful thing. And guess what? We've got that opportunity here. Right here in the state of Missouri. When this legislation comes up, I want you to ask your legislators, what's the downside to implementing this bill? What's the downside to passing it? And really, there is none. There is none. We just need to be able to approach it and say, take this kind of environment that we've got here that's become pretty partisan. Let's set that aside and let's do that for the state of Missouri. Legislators can provide choice, they can provide insurance, leadership, and stability to our state, all in a one-page bill. One-page bill. Wow. It doesn't get much more common sense than that, does it? Thank you.
You know, economic prosperity, and everything's already been said today for the most part, but economic prosperity, just to kind of sum it up, economic prosperity follows the path of least resistance. If you want to bring back jobs, you have to bring back economic freedom. That's how it works. But a really simple lesson in exactly what economic freedom is, you really don't have to go all that much further than just looking at our very own Declaration of Independence. Because in the second paragraph, which took Thomas Jefferson over 2 weeks to write, just the second paragraph, the principles that hold the walls of constitutional government in America together, it's all in just the first couple lines. So I'll explain this, and I'll help explain a little bit how it equates to economic prosperity. And this will only just take a minute. The Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? Let's start right there. All men are created equal. The first thing you need is you need equality under the law to apply to the economic sector of society, just as it would to anything else. There's a man in my district, if I'm going to move this over to the economic prosperity side, there's a man in my district. About 6 or 7 years ago, he started a business. He went from himself working it, he was able to become so successful that just in the short time span of just a handful of years, he had to hire 8 more people to help him do the job that people were coming to him to do. But unfortunately, several years ago, there were certain economic measures put into place that put him at a competitive disadvantage against his competitors. We have to be very careful. It was already touched on, Representative Zaire talked about it earlier, and I get to sit on her committee, on the Committee of Economic Development. We got to be very careful with these tax credits, because all too often, a lot of times these tax credits, when they're introduced, it creates instability in the marketplace. It creates a certain level of inequality under the law. So this man in my district had to start firing people. And so now he's down to 3 employees, including himself, that works. And the reason he has to do that is because now he's competing with somebody who's literally just across the street. And he has to pay taxes to make up, basically has to pay taxes so his competitor does not have to pay taxes. See how it puts somebody at a competitive disadvantage? When you have to make room for the tax incentives that somebody else might be receiving. All men are created equal. Whether it's certain moral or social issues, or whether it's economic issues, we got to make sure that there's equality under the law, because if there's no equality under the law, you might as well just throw your hands up and surrender, because you're already at an economic disadvantage. The second one also, all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. A lot of people don't understand really what liberty is. A lot of people don't understand what rights are. Do you have to ask permission from somebody else to exercise what you're told is a right? Do you? No, I don't think that you do. Because nobody owns me. Barack Obama, not my congressman, not my senators, nobody owns me. They have a job because 230 some years ago, the people of America decided to ratify the Constitution and give senators, give congressmen, give a president, give Supreme Court justices a job. We created them, just like Senator Lemke said, right? Now, I understand that there has to be regulations in the marketplace, because the purpose of government, according to the Declaration of Independence, okay, the purpose of government is to secure our rights, secure our liberty. So any regulation in the government really only has jurisdiction in any particular market only if it's to make sure that it's protecting you from fraud and abuse. The government should not be the sponsor of fraud and abuse. They're there to protect you. But there's a lot that can be done in our state to draw people. We have to be an attractive place for people to want to come and work. The way to do that is make sure that they know that, hey, when you come into Missouri, we're going to treat you, small businessman with 8 employees, we're going to treat you just like we would some huge corporation. We're not going to make sure that you have a competitive disadvantage. There's things that we can do to make people want to flock to America. We have to be an attractive place for people to say, that's where I want to go. That's where I have the most security to pursue happiness.
We have to start making some changes. And I think the message you heard today from the right messengers is the way to get that done. So,
Representative Kurtman and whoever else would care to answer, over the last couple of decades, we've seen just an explosion in different types of economic development programs, tax instrument financing, tax credits, enterprise zones, you name it, all to address areas where economic development has lagged and to try to boost it again. But none of them answer the question, why is economic development lagging in those areas to begin with? What do you see as the why behind why we need these different unequal economic development programs? And what can we do to address areas like St. Louis and Kansas City and other depressed areas economically without creating that economic unbalance that you talked about in your speech?
Sure. I'm going to make sure I got your question correctly. I think I'm answering it correctly. If my answer is not addressing your particular question, just make sure you put your hand back up. I think I got you, though. I think that there's different reasons why certain areas are lagging behind in economic development. A lot of times, just based on the market, things are going to change. Unfortunately, though, now our state, like the illustration that I had mentioned earlier about a guy in my district who is losing his business because he's forced to pay for the taxes of his competitor who has qualified for some new targeted tax credit, okay? His business is obviously lacking because there's a particular government program that puts him at a competitive disadvantage. Outside of that government program, he would probably be doing just fine. So I think that now that there's certain areas, certain people who are beginning to suffer economically speaking because they have to compete against a government program that takes away their ability to find any kind of economic freedom. So now we have these programs in our state forcing people to fall behind, really quite literally forcing them to fall behind. But then again, our state has to compete with the federal government because the federal government has its own programs. And then we have to compete with other countries because there's other countries around the world. They don't have all the regulations that we have. And so I think that there's a whole lot of reasons as to why somebody's might be lagging behind as far as economic development go. Did that answer your question?
Not quite.
Okay.
Because we're still kind of past the point where those economic programs were put in place to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
You look at some place like the city of St. Louis, You've got natural advantages there in built infrastructure, in roads and utilities. You've got all of the cultural amenities that exist there. You've got, at one time, a couple of generations ago, one of the premier public education systems in the country. But if you look at it today, it's completely flipped around, and parts of the city, while some areas are doing fine, others look worse than some third world countries. Why did it get that way to begin with? Because it's that why that's causing us to react with having these unequal economic programs.
First of all, I believe that there is a moral component in this whole thing. We are using a scale that doesn't have weights and equal measures. All right, and as far as the war zone, in the inner city of St. Louis, those are because of corrupt government and bad decisions made by individuals, and compound that over generations. And government cannot fix that. They will only make it worse. And when, as a legislator, your colleagues say, well, we can't unilaterally disarm because we're surrounded by 8 states. Well, that's the exact wrong attitude. If we do what is right and just, then we will be blessed for that. If we continue down the same path as everybody else and do things that aren't just, then there will be judgment. It's simple. The problem is that our legislators, and I don't know, I guess I'm as guilty as the next, okay? When a interviewer puts a mic in front of our face, we forget all of that, and we say, well, we're going to come up with a new program, and we're going to fix it. We're going to make Missouri, a place where we're job friendly, and then we come up with another China hub. I mean, come on, folks, that's why we're failing. What we need to do is do what's right, okay? Use the economic principles that Dr. Wood and others talked about, and that will work. It's not brain surgery. I mean, if a guy like me, can understand it, then just about anybody can.
Okay, Nick, my name is Ron Larrys. I think it was a Dr. Wood question. When I look at, the discussion that's going out there from our present government in the federal government I'm talking about, they're talking about how can they get into our 401s and so forth and capture that money. Then I also look at things like, we talked about devaluation of the dollar. We talk about, people over in France right now, leaders over there that have taken their money and gone from France into Russia, And then we talk about the latest thing that happened that I remember just in the last couple of days was Germany coming asking for their gold back, 300 tons of it. And the answer came from the Fed, well, it'll take 7 years. I just wonder, have they taken that gold and have they multiplied it in terms of value out there? Such a situation that even the gold is not worth the value or what economics that we have going out there from our country. So maybe, do you see where I'm going on that question? Where you can comment?
Okay. No, but the first portion of your comment had to do with things like they're going to try to. They're looking for ways to get into the 401k system and stuff like that. But then it sounds like your question.
Yeah, your retirement money is basically.
Yeah. Well, I saw the headline with regard to this Fed answer to Germany, but I didn't open the link because I was seeing several opinion pieces that were asking the question: does the Fed still have this gold that Germany thinks
That's a question.
It has possession of? And so this, I think, goes to show that I think the Fed is not being altogether forthcoming with us when it tells us that there's no need for an audit, a full audit, including an audit of its gold possession, because we're already we're already disclosing to you so much about our operations and so much about our balance sheet. There's just nothing else that you could need to know. But then you get an episode like this, right? So, I mean, I can't speculate on what the answer to this could be. I just have absolutely no way of knowing what could be going on here. But the fact that I have no way of knowing, I think, is the problem. Now, in terms of the retirement thing, I know this isn't really your question, but when you started asking about that and 401ks and stuff, it just made me think that in this current situation where, in the 1980s, it might have been realistic for you to say, I'll throw some money in a 401k and that will, I'll get some, or I'll put my money in a mutual fund and that'll get a 12% annual return, and by the time I'm 65, I'll be a multimillionaire. But that just doesn't work anymore. There's no way that's going to work. So my own approach to thinking about retirement is that instead of saving up and putting the money in a mutual fund and a la Dave Ramsey. Now, Dave Ramsey's a good guy in some ways. I mean, he's anti-debt, and that's very good. But he's always been the put your money in a mutual fund. That's not going to go anywhere these days. So I think it's much better to try to think of ways that you can earn a stream of income doing something productive. So that is to say, John Schaub's strategy, JohnSchaub.com. This guy is a very reliable strategist. Says what you should do is use these low interest rates, buy a house or two, investment property, and let the renters pay off the mortgage. And then when you retire, that's your stream of income. So you don't have to rely on, is this mutual fund going to do well for me? Is the Dow Jones going to do well for me? People got to live somewhere, and the rental market is likely to be very good, that sort of thing. Or with me, I have a subscription website. So this becomes a stream of income. It becomes like an annuity for me. And I don't have to worry about, is the government going to seize my 401k? Is this investment going to work out? I try to come up with some creative way to come up with a stream of income. Anyway, I wanted to mention that at some point today, so your retirement thing reminded me.
Good question for you then.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. My name is David Guest. I'll direct this to Doug Jaden. It would help some of us, I think, to have a kind of a flyover view of the mechanics of the legislation that's being proposed. I think known as a sound money bill last cycle. I'm not sure if it will have the same name. And just a word of commentary, I'm impressed that it's one page. When I was a kid, I used to hear the phrase, there ought to be a law, often. And I think that's part of the reason we're in the mess we're in. But here is a thing that ought to be a law. There should be no legislation at the federal level, particularly, that's any longer than the U.S. Constitution, in my thinking. But the flyover view of how the bill works, what does it do for us in particular?
Well, I'll let Representative Kurtman speak to the specifics of the bill here in Missouri. In general, how it works, I think, is a question that I'd like to expand on a little bit, the practicalities of if we were to pass this. And we can take what's gone on in Utah and extrapolate that, because the folks who are operating Utah Gold and Silver Depository they're looking for other states to expand into and to bring those same benefits that I spoke of during my talk to their state. They're not limited to Utah, they're based out of there, but they certainly understand how to implement that bill. Now, that's one of the things they're dealing with in subsequent legislative sessions in Utah, is just the practicalities of some of the implementation aspects of it. I mean, people talk about, and one of the arguments that you get in this is, hey, you're going to be carrying around a bunch of gold and silver coins, and how's that going to work? Are we going back to the 1800s? I got my coin bag on my side and all that kind of stuff. That's not how it works. We have the 21st century here, and we can marry that technology with gold and silver specie as money. There are laws on the books that allow fractional ownership of coins. It's titled in your name. And all of that can be set up in a computer system, and has been, to where you can issue a debit card and literally spend those portions of those coins either in private transactions or with merchants. That whole system exists. And so we can bring that, and that kind of implementation can come into the state.
We're going to put this underneath the Secretary of State's office. Secretary of State already have jurisdiction over investments. So if you're holding investments with an institution, that would fall under their jurisdiction. So those are two ways that's how it would work, and I have high hopes for the bill.